So glad to have everyone here. I'm excited about this. I love this topic of teaching virtually and in distance learning environment. I know a lot of the language differs from location to location. Some say distance learning, some people say remote learning, some people say virtual learning. I know where I teach, we tend to say virtual if it's synchronous distance learning, and then we say online if it's asynchronous. But every location has a different set of terminology, a different language, and I think that's okay. When I use the word distance learning or remote learning or virtual learning, I really using it interchangeably. So just a heads up. I would love for you to share, how are educators feeling right now as you think about how teachers and professors have gone through this year. What are some of the emotions that you're seeing? What are you noticing from teachers at this moment? And then we'll dive into exhausted. Yes, Barbara, that's so true. Exhausted is definitely part of it. What else? What else are folks? Yeah, isolated, definitely. That's one of the things folks have been feeling: isolated, exhausted. Anything else? What are you noticing? I'm gonna share something as people share in the chat, and I think it relates to this idea of what people are feeling, what people are going through, and how we do professional development. And so I know this seems a little off topic, but just bear with me for a couple of minutes. I made this continuum as a way to think about whether or not at the end of the year you are feeling tired or if you're actually injured, right? So what we know from the research on moral injury is that when people have experienced trauma, but also when they've had something that rocks them to their core, to their identity, when things have gone against values, when they've been asked to do things that they don't agree with, there is sometimes this sense of moral injury that they experience. On top of moral injury, there's just the role of trauma and what that had when that happens. And so I think as we think about this last year, some people are this year. Some people experience that, May teacher tired all the way back in, February, and they are just exhausted core. But some teachers, they actually experienced trauma this year. They had situations that were traumatic, secondhand trauma. Some of them lost loved ones to COVID. Some of them experienced the psychological effect of the isolation that Harmony brought up in the chat. And I think it's important to recognize that we're all in a different place here. So some teachers just need a break. Some teachers need recovery, right? More than just rest. They need a longer break. They need to process the year, make sense out of this year. Some teachers are needing restoration. They're recognizing that something was taken from this year and they need things to be restored back to what they were. And that's okay. A return to normal is not always a bad thing, but they also need and want to advocate for changes. This year may have brought up some injustices that exist in the system, and they want to advocate for change. And restoration is breaking down some of those barriers. And some of them need rehabilitation. They're hurting and they need healing. They might need therapy. I know when I experienced my hardest year of teaching ever, I left that year and said, I need counseling here. And I think that we in education don't often talk enough about the role of getting help when we need that. So I'm starting here because I want to recognize that although we'll be sharing ideas and experience, telling some stories and talking about what works, I also want to recognize the context, which is that people have had a really hard year. And so I would love for you to hear, as I share ideas, I want you to hear not so much a challenge to do things differently and more of a affirmation for the great work you're already doing. And then if there's some new ideas that you look at and say, I would love that, then we can run with that. All right, so one of the thoughts that I have is that the problem of engagement is actually in many ways a problem of ownership. Continuum that I created, and it's this idea of student agency, or how much control they have over their learning. And on one hand, we have something very teacher-centered, that's compliance. On the other one, we have something more student-centered, that's empowerment. And if you look at this continuum, we can shift from compliance, where you're doing something because you have to do it, toward engagement, where you're doing something because you want to do it, to a place of empowerment, where you're doing something because you truly, genuinely have a sense of ownership over it. You're doing it because there's buy-in. You believe that it will make a difference. So I want to talk about some ways that in virtual and distance learning classes, we can give students a sense of ownership. And I'm going to share kind of a personal story first about this. One of the tendencies that happen is that students disengage. It can feel like you're teaching into the void. It can feel, especially in virtual learning sessions, when you see a sea of black screens, like you're just teaching into the abyss. The very first time I taught in a virtual session, I hated it. I did not like distance learning. So here's the background. We had prepared an amazing STEM camp for our students. And in year one of the STEM camp, we redefined summer school to be hands-on, text integrated, blended learning. And we called it a STEM camp instead of summer school. We made it fun. We made it engaging. We still met all the standards. We were still doing language supports for students and all this kind of stuff. And it was going really well. That first year we did photojournalism that ended up helping launch a redesign of an entire course. We did a professional development component for the teachers that participated. And we did STEM projects, and we had all of these different components, a studio going on, a maker space that we developed, and everything was prepared in year two to do the same thing. And then something happened. A week before we were about to launch our summer school, the electricity went out. And when the electricity went out, I'm not entirely sure what happened, with maybe a power surge or something, but when they tried to get the AC back on, the air conditioning didn't work. Now, this was in Phoenix, Arizona, which, if you're not familiar with Phoenix, it is blazingly hot. People say it's a dry heat, and so are ovens, right? Because it is just hot. And we could not justify having kids indoors, even with fans running, having kids indoors when it was 121 degrees. Now, it did get down later that week, down to a balmy 117, but again, way too hot. So what do we do? How do we fix it? And at that moment, we decided we're going to have to go distance. Now, the upside is we had an amazing technology team, and we worked with our tech director, and he was able to get buses with Wi-Fi and mobile hotspots. We were able to get Chromebooks out to students and do a checkout system. We did some work on Friday and Saturday and met with families, and we made it happen. But we had to completely redefine what we were doing. And to be honest, I was not loving it. I absolutely hated teaching distance, because when I would do, we were using Google Hangouts for it. We didn't even have Zoom yet, so we couldn't do the same, small groups, and we had to send links to multiple Hangout rooms. And I kept saying that I felt like I was teaching underwater, right? There was a delay. We couldn't do that amazing Socratic seminar that we did before. And we couldn't do the same hands-on maker projects that I wanted to do. And all I could think about was what we couldn't do. And it felt like I was teaching underwater. Like there was this fuzziness, this when you spoke, there was a delay with people, and I couldn't read their body language, and it just wasn't working. But I remember I met with my fellow teacher, Javi, and I said, how did the first day go? And he was like, it was amazing. And I said, why? And he said, because I got to learn these different things. I tried this, I tried this, I tried to experiment with this, I tried that. And I suddenly realized his mindset was, how can I experiment? What can I do? And my driving question, what can't I do? I had a deficit mindset. I was obsessed with what are the things that I used to be able to do that I can't do anymore. And he was asking, what can we do now that we're not confined to the four walls of our classroom? And so he was doing a bunch of different, scavenger hunts, and we did scavenger hunt leading to maker projects, and find items from your house and do that for the maker project. Pair kids up where they're working collaboratively, and one of them's giving directions while the other one's making something at home. And it was amazing. And I realized that my biggest challenge when it came to engaging students in distance learning was my own deficit mindset. I was thinking, how do I translate the learning from face-to-face blended to distance learning? And he was focused entirely on, how do I transform the learning, right? If we think about the Sammer model, he was all the way up in redefinition, asking what is the creative and connective capacity of this technology? And I was down in substitution, trying to just substitute it. And so I had a real issue when it came to teaching in a distance learning environment. Now, by the end of that first week, I loved it. By the end of the second week, I was totally bought in. And then the next year, when we did our STEM camp, we had two strands. We had a virtual camp and we had a face-to-face camp, and we had students who opted into both. And then later, when I became a professor, I jumped at the opportunity to teach virtually. And I also jumped at the opportunity to run STEM camps through the Oregon Writing Project, where they were virtual writing camps as well. So before we get into and take a deeper dive into specific ways to empower our students, one of the things that I want to say that I noticed was it really came down to our mindset as educators. And when it came to the students that were the most successful, it was not so much the ones who were engaged, it was the ones who were empowered, the ones who could be creative and engage in problem solving, the ones who could get started on the work, the ones who could manage their learning. They were the ones who did the best. So I'm going to share 7 different ideas for empowering students in virtual learning. But I want to begin with this recognition that empowered teachers empower students, that it really does begin with the role of the educator, that we are the architects designing those systems that empower students. So before I share these specific strategies, just in the chat, because I've been talking for a while, I would love for you to share what is just one small practice when it comes to teaching virtually that you found that led to higher levels of student engagement. So when you ask the question, how do we engage students in virtual learning? What is one strategy that you realized that works really well for me? And just share in the chat. Cameras on, yes, definitely. Any other strategies that worked? I'd love for you to share. Just any small thing. Laugh about your own mistakes. Yes, being human, that makes such a huge difference. I'm a huge fan of doing little things that allow for goofiness and humor and humility as educators. Waterfall chats, I love that you brought that up, Barbara, because one of the things I found was I didn't even know about waterfall chats until this year. So I had been teaching virtually for the last 5 years, and somebody else, I was observing a classroom and they did waterfall chats, and I was like, that is awesome. Any other strategies that have been helpful? All right. Then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again and just jump right into the slideshow. So number one is providing choice and flexibility. And so what this means is choice and flexibility in assignment. If we think about student agency, if we think about ownership, this is recognizing that the more of a sense of autonomy and agency that they have, the better off they'll do. So here are some small ways. One is by providing choice menus. If we think about from student-centered or from teacher-centered to student-centered, we have 4 levels of choice menus that you can do online. And what I love about choice menus is this is an asynchronous option. So if kids are working virtually and they have slow things aren't working for them, this is something that can be done asynchronously. And it's just a simple choice menu. The first one is embedded choice. This is where you give them, it could be a set word problems, and you say, choose 3 of the 5 word problems to do. It's really simple choice. You're still guiding most of the parameters, but you're giving them some choices. Here's a warm-up. Choose one of the options in the warm-up. Level 2 is a simple choice menu. It's something like this, where you actually give like 5 different tasks that they do or 5 different assignment options, and they're really different from one another. Making a podcast is very different from a video versus a blog post versus creating a study guide, but the criteria is still the same. You're doing a book review, so you're reviewing the author's language and word choice. You're reviewing the plot, the setting, the characterization, the themes, how they relate to society and culture. And students are doing book reviews, but there's 4 different options on how they review their books. And so that would be this idea of a simple choice menu. At a younger grade, it might be something like those tic-tac-toe boards that teachers sometimes do. A more advanced version is an advanced choice menu. If you look at this advanced choice menu, students select learning targets, and then they can select the resources and their finished product. And what I love about this is you can curate, you create the learning targets, you can curate the resources for them, and then they have options on their finished product. And if you need to give them some more directions on how to make a blog post, an essay, a slideshow, whatever, you can just link those inside of the product tab, and they use this simple grid to help them kind of do it like almost like a choose your own adventure. Now there is a more advanced version, so if you're a little more tech savvy and you want to try it, you can do this as a sort of a choose your own adventure style Google form, and they click on the Google form and it takes them through each part. So they select their learning targets, that then narrows down the resources. They go through the different resources, they open tabs for the resources, and then when they're done with that, they move to the finished product, and it's based on the resources that they did, and it becomes much more personalized. A more advanced version would be an independent project. And an independent project is something like a Genius Hour project, where they're working fully independently. They get the opportunity to this independent project and do things on their own, and 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 it's a fully independent project. What I love about Genius Hour is it's based on Google's 20% time. It was actually first created in the 1960s by, actually late 1950s, by 3M. And it's the notion of giving people one day out of the week to work on their own independent projects. And what I love about virtual and distance environments is those independent projects become easier to do because there's more freedom in terms of time and space. So that's the first idea. It's this idea of providing choice and flexibility. A second idea, though, is to empower students to choose the topic. So giving them the opportunity to choose whatever topic they want. One of my favorite examples of this is giving students the choice of topic on something like Geek Out blogs. So I'm going to share a little bit about what Geek Out blogs are and how they work. If you look at the language arts standards for, the Common Core standards, they are all topic neutral. Students have the opportunity to choose whatever topic they want when it comes to reading and writing. What that allows for is for informational reading and writing, they can do research on whatever topic they want. So Geek Out blogs are basically, we're covering the standards, but you can do skateboarding if you want. You can do, fashion. You can do any kind of thing that you're into. And what I found was that when we did this at the beginning of the year and students did their Geek Out blogs, that the students that were working synchronously or asynchronously could work on the blogs at the same time. And then I could pull them aside and they could do conversations back and forth. We could do a writer's workshop if we wanted. I can put them in small groups and they could do peer assessment back and forth. But by starting with Geek Out blogs at the beginning of the year, you're tapping into their prior knowledge. So a lot of times reading and writing is tough because students just don't have the prior knowledge in certain areas. But if they have that prior knowledge, if they are complete nerds when it comes to video games or baseball or ballet or art or biology or whatever it may be, what I love is they can start with those geeky interests and then they can practice their reading and writing skills. Now, if you're in a subject where there's not as much freedom, what you can do is you can do an audit of your standards and see which ones are topic neutral. So when I taught social studies, we would do a 2-week history project that was all the historical methods standards. So they were looking at primary sources, they were creating timelines. And I said, you do a history of whatever you want. And it was amazing how deep they went. Someone went really deep and powerful in the history of Black hair. And as an African-American student, she really dove into sort of the politics of hair and the history of hair and used hair as this, almost like this metaphor for every aspect of the last 200 years. And it was powerful because she had that prior knowledge. So again, it's this idea of letting them choose the topics. Sometimes it's choosing topics within a subject that you're teaching. So giving them a chance to select the topics within science with maybe it's forces in motion, but they can find some key topics within that they're going to choose. A small thing that you can do at the very beginning of the year is something like this. It's a show and tell activity. So you're giving them an opportunity to select the topics and they're choosing items that represent their culture or an item that represents a hobby that they do. In a math class, it could be something like, show me an example, bring in an example of math in real life and talk about it. And now you're connecting the subject to the context. The third idea is to empower students to self-select the scaffolds. And what you're going for here is an idea of a universal design approach. So if we think about universal design outside of learning, so outside of UDL, just regular universal design, it is the idea that you make things universally accessible for all people, disability or not. So instead of differentiating, you're focusing on inclusion. If you think about something like curb cuts, they're designed for people with wheelchairs or limited mobility. But when I was when my kids were little, as a dad, I used curb cuts all the time to push strollers or ramps. I loved having ramps because I could push a stroller up a ramp. It wasn't designed for me, but I found it useful, right? I don't have any difficulty hearing, but I love having subtitles on when I watch shows just so I don't miss what I'm looking at. That's a universal design aspect. I will often, with my phone, use the voice to text. It's not designed for me, but I use that because I find it helpful. So you can do the same thing in education. And this is built on the idea of universal design for learning. I'm not going to take a dive into it. If you ever look at Dr. David Rose, he has some amazing work around this. But one of the ideas is that you provide the scaffolds for all students and you teach them how to find those scaffolds. So what you can do is create a bank of technology tutorials. And you as a teacher are curating this. You can work with fellow teachers in your grade level band. You put together a single document like a Google Doc or a Word doc, and students can just click on those tutorials. And what I found was that the video tutorials are super helpful, but you can also actually ask certain students who are really advanced in their technology skills to create some on their own. And what they'll do is they'll convert some videos into GIFs or GIFs. I'm not going to enter that argument. And then create text-based tutorials with some of those GIFs or GIFs right under them. And a lot of students use those as well. Some teachers will empower their students in terms of having a tech help team. So I was working with a school and they had shifted into distance and learning, and they had sort of, it was like a student version of a Genius Bar or a Geek Squad. And they were using Remind as the texting platform, and students could just text when they needed help. And in some cases, they did phone calls back and forth, and they would just meet with students who were struggling with their technology. And they were using this as a class where they were basically technology aids. You can also create a curation of academic tutorials and have those tutorials in a curated space that students can access. You can do language support, so providing students with an online bank of anchor charts that they can access, or front-loaded vocabulary. I found that having a vocabulary blog can be really helpful, and hyperlinking in the directions, whenever there's directions to vocabulary words, send them to a single blog post with the definition, a sample sentence, a picture to go with it for their vocabulary. And in some cases, even doing something like a TPR where there's hand movements that they can practice with the vocabulary. And again, it's just going back to this idea of universal design. What I would love for you to share is in the chat, how do we help teachers become self-directed in finding their own help? So when it comes to students, we can take this universal design approach. But for teachers, what are some ways that we can help teachers become more self-directed in finding their own tutorials and scaffolds and help as well? Because that can be one of the struggles, is if a teacher says, I'm just not that self-directed, I struggle with technology, what are some ways we can help them become self-directed as well? So just share that in the chat if you'd be willing. And as you're doing that, I'll move on to number 4, empower learners to own the creative process. So when I think about my own college experience, I took online classes in my undergraduate and graduate courses. And in my undergraduate courses, online learning basically was fully asynchronous, and we never created anything. It was, again, fully asynchronous, and basically it was an online version of a book study. We would read from a chapter. We're done. We would join the online forum or discussion board, and we would answer questions. Now, I didn't mind it. I enjoyed writing essays. I enjoyed answering questions. I liked some of the discussions. But we never really connected with each other. We never really created anything. And then I contrast that to my very first course that I took in my master's in educational technology. And it was fully project-based. And at first, I didn't understand what we were doing. We were supposed to be learning about learning tools. And we never learned about which learning tools exist and what to do. Instead, we did a project-based learning activity in small groups. We used, creative platforms and connective platforms. We had to curate which ones were working best and analyze which ones were working best. We had to find them on their own. But the class existed as a 9-week deep dive project-based learning activity that was all about how you would redevelop a rural town that had lost half their population when the copper mines had gone out of business in Arizona. It was authentic. We were interviewing community members. We connected via video conferencing with people in the community. Even though we didn't live there, we were constantly connecting with them. And it didn't strike me until the very end that this class was all about learning tools, and we were supposed to focus on, ways to use it creatively and connectively, that I then had this aha moment that I had learned all of these different learning tools by using them in project-based learning. And that I had come alive in that class because I got to actually make something. I would love for you to share, because I know nobody shared in the chat. That was totally fine. But I would love for you to share, when it comes to having learners own the creative process, why do we want kids to engage in creative work online? What happens when they engage in creative work online? So for me, one of the things I'll say is that was the most I had ever been engaged, and it was the hardest I ever worked in an online class. Love that. They learn critical thinking skills. And I'm just going to brag on one of my own, my son's teacher. He had a teacher who said, I can't teach online. I don't like teaching online. I teach in a makerspace. I'm an engineering teacher and I teach robotics. How are you expecting me to teach? And he was not excited about that. But oh my gosh, he had students doing projects, doing robotics projects, doing these short little 1 and 2 day engineering challenges, using items that they could pick up at school, items that were dropped off to them, items at their own house. And he worked within that creative constraint to do these engineering challenges. And my son, who was one of those kids who would turn his microphone off and his camera off, and he might take notes the whole time, but he didn't engage in his history class, which was all lecture-based, he came alive in engineering. He was excited about robotics. And he joined the robotics team, and they engaged in the state competition. And even though these weren't his friends, this isn't who he would normally hang out with, he absolutely loved it. And I noticed the same thing happened with him that happened with me. Learning things like project management, empathy, becoming systems thinkers and hackers and rebels and problem solvers, engaging in iterative thinking, thinking divergently, making connections. All of these things happen when they own the creative process. So some of it might be having kids blog. Some of it might be letting them podcast or make videos, doing design thinking projects, doing small design sprints, having them engage in creative prompts. I have, and I'll put this here in the chat, videowritingprompts.com, where I have a bunch of video prompts that I've created specifically for students, and I have some maker prompts as well. The other thing is, on my YouTube channel, I've created these spencervideos.com. If you check that out, you can find a bunch of different prompts I created. It's sometimes something as small as doing a hands-on activity where you take distance learning away from the screen. Here's something I did with second graders that I then did with graduate students. And in both cases, they loved it. You give them 3 minutes to go around their house and find something flat, something round, something sticky. They then create a prototype, and you do rapid prototyping. And what you're doing is you're pushing divergent thinking. They're developing that critical divergent thinking skill that will serve them for a lifetime. And all they're doing is creating a children's toy or a game. And then describing in a paragraph how it works. You can do a variation of this where they create their prototype and they use something like Flipgrid to show people how their toy works. And what I love about using Flipgrid and some of those options is that they can do it in the moment, but it's also asynchronous, so they can watch each other's videos and give each other feedback. So you're having that interplay of synchronous and asynchronous. Number 5 is the idea of empower learners in collaborative work. So this is the idea of using breakout rooms and small groups and putting members in teams. Now, because participation can be lower in virtual learning, I think personally that 4 is perfect as a number in face-to-face rooms. Just through trial and error, I have found that 6 is the optimal number for me when it comes to doing breakout rooms and having students work virtually, because where I work, we have a large number of students with internet that can be unstable. I teach students all over the state at our university, and there are certain rural areas where there still is, there's just not fast internet. And so students might go to McDonald's, they might go to Starbucks, and drive an hour away to the nearest Starbucks where the internet's a little faster, but it's not perfect. It is a struggle. And for that reason, I find that 6 works really well. And then having them create shared norms, having them create, feedback, shared experiences, doing little checkups on them and seeing how they're doing, using breakout rooms, shared documents. One of my favorite things is just short emails to students where you're seeing how they're doing surveys to check in on them. I would love for you to share right now, what are some ways that you have built community with students online, and how has that worked? And while you're doing that, I'm just going to share these questions that I use to kind of get feedback from students at the beginning of a semester about what works best for them. So what are some strategies that you've found to work in terms of building community? Share time at the beginning of class. I love that. One of the things that I have started doing is things like, what is a song that you've discovered in the last four weeks? Or what is a show you've binge watched in the last month? And then putting students in groups based on what shows they've binge watched and just letting them talk about it for 5 minutes. I've tried long-term group projects. Yeah, I love that. One small thing for collaboration that works really well for me is I'll just share a couple of engagement strategies that worked really well. And I don't have a visual for this, but I'm going to talk about it for a moment. I love doing a carousel activity. So here's what I do for a carousel activity. I'll have like 6 case studies on a Google Doc, and some of them will be having students analyze a picture and doing something like a connect extend challenge, which is a project 0 protocol. Sometimes it'll be something like a see, think, wonder that they do. Sometimes I'll have very specific questions that they have to answer. And what I'll do is case number 1 or example number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6. And then students are put in breakout room number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So on the Google Doc, it'll say, case 1, and then next to it, it'll say breakout room number 1, and so on and so forth. And then you give them 5 minutes and they look at it, they answer the question on that Google Doc. And then when the 5 minutes are up, you just send a message, and I use Zoom, to the breakout rooms, and it says switch. It's time to switch to the next one. And then on that Google document, what I'll do is I'll just type. The 1 becomes, a 2, the 2 becomes a 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6 becomes a 1. And so now the breakout rooms are just moving down on that Google Doc, and they can see it while they go. And it is a simple strategy. It doesn't take any time to prep. And what I love about it is one member of the group can be the recorder while everyone else is talking, and you rotate who the recorder is as a group. And that's a quick way. It doesn't take a lot of prep work. It's a carousel activity, and you can do it over the course of a whole class period. And you can monitor, right? You can keep students accountable by watching that Google Doc to make sure each group is doing that. And you can pop into different breakout rooms where you want to, but the accountability piece is that you're watching that Google Doc. Another activity that I like that's a super quick one is you put a slide on the screen, and it's just a seating chart, and you say turn to your shoulder partner, and in the chat private message them an answer to this question. And so everyone's chatting privately with each other. They don't have to leave for a breakout room. They don't have to talk to one another. It's super fast. And then you continue and move on. And it's a quick engagement strategy that mimics the think, pair, share activity you might do in a face-to-face classroom. One more activity that I like, if the class is, even if they're big, is putting on the screen a value line question. So what I'll do is like a critical thinking question, and then you go from agree to disagree. And in a classroom, you might typically have students walk back and forth to the 2 different sides. And what I do is I do agree to disagree, and they use the annotation tool, which is available, and they just put a dot on where they are from agree to disagree. And then they can add dots when someone brings up a good point on one side to the next from agree to disagree. And I just have students call and say, I'm at a this for that reason. And our continuum goes from 0 to +5 and from 0 to -5. And they say, I'm at a 3 because this, I'm at a -2 because this. And it actually becomes a really dynamic value line conversation where you can call on students and see where they are, but you're using that annotation tool. I'm going to go back to this for a moment and just say the final one is to empower students to own the assessment process. So this one is this notion of having students engage in self-assessment in the online courses. So things like goal tracking, self-reflections, student surveys, doing self-assessment rubrics. So, giving students a rubric and letting them fill it out on their own. And then I love having students convert a rubric to a checklist. So if you think about it this way, I am a huge fan of rubrics. However, when we work on projects in life, we very rarely pull out a rubric. Like I did a home improvement project at our house, which is a little bit of a lie. I didn't do the project. I did the tear down. My wife did the project. She is the one who is really handy. And so when we were doing this project, we had tons of checklists. We never once pulled out a rubric and said, how's our, let's rate ourselves from 1 to 4 on where we are on this part of the project. It's just not what people do when they do projects. We did, however, use checklists. So what I love is to have students take a checklist and you just put it online, and then they can, or take a rubric, put it online, and convert that rubric into a checklist. that they can then use. And what I love about checklists is there are so many different online checklists that you can do. You can take the rubric, make it into a checklist, and have it as a Google form, and just have them fill out their checklist each day to show how much progress they are. And then it's giving them a progress bar, monitoring for them how far they are and how far behind they are on the project as well. There's a lot of different ways, to have them do this. I'll say one more thing. I love having them do concept maps, or having them create a drawing of their self-reflection using no words, and then just take a snapshot with their phone. One of the things that the mistakes I made when it came to the very first virtual course that I taught was I didn't have students do anything by hand. It was all typed. And I realized, no, you know what? Sketch notes, concept maps, these things work really well by hand. And then just take a picture and upload it to our learning management system. Also, having students engage in peer assessment. So I love this because it's timed and it takes 10 minutes, and you can put students into a breakout room in pairs, and they go through this process of an elevator pitch, clarifying questions, feedback, paraphrase, and next steps. And then you can house this, on the slideshow on a tab that they can reference while they're in their, breakout room, giving each other peer feedback. Another option would be, something like a 3-2-1 structure, peer coaching that they do, and also a peer feedback carousel. So I mentioned doing the Google Docs version of a carousel activity. You can also have each group put their work as a separate post on the learning management system, put them into breakout rooms, have them discuss and give feedback as a group, and do a carousel activity that way. We've done carousel activities on Flipgrid where groups move from Flipgrid to Flipgrid to Flipgrid. So we take it away from the LMS and into something like Flipgrid. So there's a lot of different ways that they can do this as well. So those are all just some different ideas when it comes to empowering students in virtual and distance environments. So what I would love for you to do is just one final thing. If you'd be willing to, just share one key takeaway from this session, just one idea that you say, I might try that. What is one key takeaway? And with that said, I'm out of time, but thank you for those who shared in the chat. I really appreciate it, and have a wonderful day.